Gospel of John. We're still slowly making it through kind of the introduction to this gospel in John chapter 1. And our approach, those that are visiting with us tonight, our approach in our study of the Gospel of John is trying to take a look at this writing, at this book, the way that the very first readers of this gospel would have read it. This gospel was not aimed, it wasn't written for the Jews. It wasn't written for those who were already believers. It was written for those in the first century who were the Roman world, the Greek culture. And we have done a lot of digging in just these first few verses and seeing the way that John is using some of the things of that culture to help introduce the idea of who Jesus is. He hasn't even mentioned Jesus yet. As a matter of fact, tonight we'll see it. But so far, he hasn't even mentioned the idea of the man of Jesus. He started with the idea in verse 1 of the Logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. That's something that the Greek culture was very familiar with. They understood Logos. They understood it as some kind of that supreme mind that's out there that they didn't really understand, but they believed it was there. And some people connect this to the temple of the unknown God in Athens. Paul mentions or Luke mentions in Acts chapter 17. But there was this, last week we spent a lot of time looking at Greek mythology to get an idea of, if we don't understand what these people who are reading this, what they believed and what their culture involved, then it's hard for us to really understand why John is saying some of the things that he's saying. Because he's writing to those people that are believing in all of those Greek gods. And so John is trying to use some of the ideas that they're familiar with, where John introduces this Logos that became the light, that light that shines in the darkness. The idea of light and enlightenment, that was a very Greek thing. Enlightenment versus being ignorant. Light being something connected to truth. Darkness being something connected to things that were false. That's a very ancient Greek idea. And so he's using a lot of these things to try to help them understand. We ended last week looking at verses 10 through 13. Where John writes, again, this is all about the Logos. And as we've talked about the last couple of weeks, we know who the Logos is referring to because we've read the rest of the story. But they didn't know yet. They're still working their way through these first few verses, and so they haven't been introduced to that yet. So all they know is that this Logos is not even a him to them. It's an it. It's a thing. Yeah.
Would the Greek not have told him as a masculine in just the tense form that they used it or not?
Well, but even in that, it can still be the auto, the pronoun that's used there, can still be something that is referring to it. There's a lot of words that are masculine words that are things, and so you take like a Greek word for table. I'm not sure but it's probably a masculine word, but it's not a him. It's still an it, but it's in the masculine. To the Greeks, the Logos was a thing. They did not connect it with a god. They didn't connect it with a person. It was just something out there that had a supreme mind of some kind, that it created all the organization around the universe. It's what made the sun rise the same time, and everything that happens in nature and everything. There was something that was a design. It was like it was put there by some kind of a mind. That's what they understood. And some of the quotes that we looked at, what they referred to the logos, gives you that sense like they knew something was there, but they weren't exactly sure what it was. And John is using that something to say, I'm going to tell you more about that something. I'm going to reveal that to you, which to the Greeks they loved, because they love philosophy, they love new ideas. So if somebody comes in with a brand new idea, they're going to jump all over that. And until they can prove to them that, well, that's ridiculous, that doesn't make any sense. And so John's going to walk them down that trail of continually showing them, this is what the Logos is. And I'm going to introduce you to more details about this Logos. And he just kind of, it's like putting that bait out there. And he brings them a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And what we're going to see tonight, when we get to verse 14, is he's going to set the hook and really show this is what the Logos is. And so, here in verse 10 through 13, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. And he came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. Now remember, we talked about a lot of those, the Greek mythology and the Greek gods and the things like that they believed in. A lot of the things that that John is bringing out here are things that they would, when it comes to their belief in their gods, they would see this. They say, okay, that makes sense. There were times when it was believed that he was in the world. They believed that some of their gods sometimes came into the world to mess around and do things, usually cause trouble, and then would leave. So they're like, okay, I can buy that. Those who received him gave the right to become children of God. There were Zeus in Greek mythology is said to have had over 100 children, many of them with human women. And so this would have been something of being a children of a god. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we talked about the elites in the Roman society, they would actually try to trace their genealogy back to the fact I was born from the line of a Greek god. And so that would give them more status, and it would give them more importance. And to us today, we think about that Greek mythology, we think about it as, mythology, myth. They didn't. It was fact, it was history, it was truth. All of those gods were real. All of those events of Zeus coming down and having affairs with all these women, they believed every word of it, that it was all true. That was the world they lived in. And so this idea of becoming a child of God, this is being introduced to people who may not have been elite. And so here's maybe a slave in the Roman world who's hearing this, that he gives the right to become children of God to those who believe in his name. That's going to pique their curiosity. I mean, I could be a child of a God? And so John is completely playing in to this Roman culture and thinking. But he goes on, he says, who were born not of blood. So he's like, it's not about what line you're born into, like the Romans were trying to do. It's not about that. Nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. It's something that is only determined by God himself. And so then in verse 14, John then here's the big reveal. All this time, Logos. I'm telling you about the Logos and what the Logos is, and the Logos is light, and the Logos came in amongst his own creation, and all these things. And then verse 14, he finally says, and the Word, that's the word Logos, and the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so the big reveal that John's been working up to. Everything else, we saw a quote from Augustine from the 5th century a couple of weeks ago, where Augustine had gone and studied and looked at this first paragraph here in John chapter 1, and he comments on everything that I see John writing agrees with all of the philosophers. He's using the same type of language, the same type of ideas, and then he says, until, well, like I said, he didn't know it was verse 14 because the verses weren't numbered back then. But when he got to what we know now as verse 14, he said, this is the first time I've ever heard anything like this. This was a new concept, that the Logos became flesh. This mind that's out there that they did believe gave messages to the gods and directed the gods, and this mind that would give messages to oracles to be messengers to people on earth, and all this Logos becoming flesh, that didn't make any sense to them. So, but this is what John's been working up to this whole time, using these words and ideas that they were familiar with and that they would completely agree with, and then revealing this amazing thing that God did. And so the Logos becomes flesh. The flesh, the word there, it literally means flesh and blood. And so the Greeks and the Romans, they believed that some of their gods would sometimes take human form, and they would sometimes meddle in human affairs, but they would have never heard of a God who had actually taken on real flesh and blood and become a human. That was something they would have never heard of. No Roman God would ever stoop to something that low. But John, he explains here, this is exactly what the Logos did. The Logos became flesh. And the Logos didn't just become human for an hour. He didn't just become human for a day or two. He dwelt among us. Literally, he took up residence among us. He lived with us. And now, here's where John begins to make it personal. Because this next he says, and we saw his glory. So John is referring to himself now. Personal account. We, John and those with John, as a writer, he's speaking as an eyewitness. We saw his glory. So this word glory in Greek, it's a word doxa. It's a word that refers to the qualities that made the Logos glorious. We saw his glory. What were the things that John saw that made the Logos, we know, is Jesus, but what did John see that revealed his glory? What kind of things? How did they know that Jesus had glory? That he was glorious, that there was something different about him.
They saw his miracles. They saw how he acted among people and what he taught.
Okay.
And then there was the time Peter, James, and John all went up to the mountain together. Jesus was transfigured.
Yeah. John was one of them that was there at the transfiguration. He would have seen that. All the miracles that Jesus performed. Even in the way that Jesus taught, how many times did we hear the people, they were marveled at the way he taught. They'd never heard anything like it before. And so the glory of God, the glory of Jesus, it's wrapped in all these miraculous things that he did while he was here. And the Romans, they're going to be curious about what convinced John and others that were with John that this man Jesus that they talk about all the time, what convinced them that he was actually the Logos and that he came to live among us mortals? And the Romans, they would want to hear the evidence of this God's glory, the abilities and the qualities that proved that he was not just a man. And so we read about in John's account, he begins to go walk through the various miracles, and he all through the gospel. There's, I think, 20 miracles that John records in his gospel. And flip to the end of the gospel real quick. John chapter 20 and verse 30. Because this is how John begins to sum up everything at the end of his gospel. And notice what he focuses on. It says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so here in the beginning, John is introducing it. We saw his glory. We saw what made him glorious. And I'm going to be telling you about that all the way through what I write. And at the very end, he ends with, there's so many more stories that I could tell you about that didn't fit in this book. But the whole reason why I wrote what I wrote was so that you would believe. When you read what he actually did, you will be able to see the glory that he really had. And so he goes on, he says, glory as only from the Father. And so what we saw in this man, John is saying, his abilities, his qualities that made him glorious, they can only be described as coming from the Father. Now, as I was going through this, and I'm trying, as I'm reading through this, I'm a Roman in the first century. I've never heard any of this before. I've never studied Judaism. I don't know the history of the Jews. I don't know the history of what God did with all the children of Israel. I'm hearing this message about what John's writing about for the very first time. And John uses the term Father. They don't know who God the Father is, like John's referring to. The Romans would not have understood who John was calling Father yet, because that's another thing that John is going to do throughout the rest of the book. 140 times John is going to refer to the Father. Now, in a book the size of the Gospel of John, that's a lot. And so 140 times. And so by the end of this gospel, they are going to have a clear picture of who this Father that John is referring to is. And this was kind of a side study that I started doing over the last few days. Is I've been going through all of these accounts of the Father, the way Jesus describes the Father. And it's a really neat study. Because if you just look at that and you understand, John is going to try to introduce God as Father, but he has to introduce it to a pagan-minded people who believe in all kinds of gods, and he's trying to get them to understand there's only one true God. And he's going to use this term Father to describe it. And so I started asking a lot of questions of why would he use that term? We'd understand it when Matthew uses it in Matthew's gospel, because that gospel was written to the Jews. And so when he refers to him as the Heavenly Father or as Father, they get that because they understood who God was as Father. But John using it here, I think it's another term that they were familiar with, and even familiar with in context of the gods. And John's going to use it to try to begin moving their mind closer and closer to understanding the one true God. This is the first mention of Father here. And the Romans, they did have a picture in their mind already of the father of the gods. The father of the gods was Zeus. Or that was the Greek name. The Romans changed it to Jupiter. But Zeus, in their culture, that's what when they would have heard Father connected to the Logos, they would have probably been thinking, oh, there is a God on Mount Olympus that is over all of the other gods, and so he's the father of the gods. As a matter of fact, he was the father of many of those other gods who were known as the Olympians. And so we have a lot of history within Greek mythology of the father of the gods. But John is saying that the glory, the power, and the abilities that he saw in this Logos that became flesh, that it can only be described as coming from the Father. I would immediately put a picture in their head of this was great power. This is something that's coming from the gods in one way or another. But then John immediately says something that would have contradicted the Romans' idea that this was Zeus. Because Zeus in Greek mythology was really nothing more than a troublemaker for mankind. He just liked to cause problems. You read all their stories of the Greek mythology. The father of their gods, if a human being did something to upset him, he would come down and he would just ruin their life. That's what their beliefs were. That's when you had disease or you had some kind of a tragedy or something like that, they would say that it was one of the gods, and so a lot of times they blame it Zeus. It was Zeus, that I did something that must have upset him, and that's why these horrible things are going on in my life. And so if he was ever offended, he would take his wrath out on man. And he was known for lying. He was known for cheating. He was known for stealing, just so he could get his way. See, in the Roman ideas of gods, they were not moral beings. They actually were extremely immoral. But that was that Greek god culture that they believed in. So what John's going to say now about the Logos who became flesh, this Logos who is the Father, he says is full of grace and truth. That was not Zeus. Zeus was not full of grace and truth. And so you see how he's leading them into this concept and this idea of something that they would have related to. But now he's saying, but who I'm talking about is different. Who I'm talking about is full of truth. He's full of grace. He's already talked about these things, about the Logos in the first few verses. But so any inclination that they had about this Father who gave the Logos, this Logos man, his power, any idea they had that this was Zeus, that's already being challenged, because this doesn't describe Zeus at all. So you see, John not only has to find a way to show them who Jesus is, but he also has to find a way to explain that there is really only one God. I don't know if we ever really stop and consider how difficult it was in the first century to talk to Romans about the one true God and about his plan and about Jesus Christ, and to be able to teach them the truth when they had all of these lies that they had been living under for so long. And so this is not going to be an easy task. And these people have believed in all of these Greek gods for over 1,000 years. And so with this idea of Father, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start a list. As we go through the gospel, we're going to say, what do we learn about the Father from John's gospel? How John is describing the Father. And actually, usually it's Jesus, almost all the time. It's going to be Jesus who's in his teaching is going to be talking about the Father. And so the very first thing that we learn here in verse 14 is that the Father was full of grace and truth. So that's the very first thing that we learn. That's going to come into play with other things as we continue to look at this. But in verse 6 and 7, if you look back in verse 6 and 7, he mentioned a man who was sent from God, whose name was John, talking about John the Baptist, who came to testify about the light. So we talked about John being the messenger. In the Greek Roman culture, that would have been like an oracle that they believed in, that the gods would send messages through oracles to give to mankind. And so this was not a strange concept for them, that the Logos would send a messenger of some kind. And so here, John is this messenger. And in the next few verses then, we get a little preview of what John the Baptist said about this Logos human. We still don't know who he is yet. We just know that the Logos has become flesh. We just know that the Logos has become human. But we don't know anything else about him yet. And so John is going to go on here from verse 15. It says, "And John testified about him and cried out, saying, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ.'" There it is for the first time. He mentions Jesus. "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." And so remember again, the Romans, they would have seen John as one of these oracles, a messenger sent from the gods. And there weren't very many people who could claim to be a higher rank than an oracle. We talked about the oracle of Delphi, or Delphi, and how important that oracle was. There were not very many people in Roman culture that could claim to be of a higher status than an oracle. Well, here is a messenger sent from God who, one of the first things he says is, "The one who's coming after me is a higher rank than I am." You know, I'm not the most important one here. This would have been a strange thing for the Romans to think about. You're talking about, this must have really been the Logos. If there's anything that would be greater than an oracle, a messenger, then the Logos would qualify. The Logos would fit. And so they're probably beginning to make some of these connections. But he qualifies it by saying that it's because the one who is coming after him actually existed before him. Well, that takes us back to verse 1. What did verse 1 tell us about the Logos? John 1:1. "In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." And so he's saying, see, John, when he came, he was a man who was born, but the one coming after him, the Logos, who became flesh, he didn't just start to exist when he became flesh. He has always existed. He existed before that. And so this is going to be one of those things that the Greeks are going to be going, "Oh, this is crazy. Tell us more. We want to know more about this Logos." Well, the qualities that made him the Logos, of his fullness. That word fullness is a word that means completeness. This is there in verse 16. His completeness we have all received. In other words, we have received his grace, grace upon grace. The grace that the Logos brought is more grace than we even needed. He had grace on top of grace. What he brought with him, what he did for us, was so amazing. And he continues to build up who this Logos was. And it's not possible to put into words what the Logos has done for every single one of us. And for the very first time then in verse 17, John reveals the name of this Logos man. This grace and this truth, from verse 14, was realized, it took place through Jesus Christ. Now, some Romans may have heard of Jesus by this point, because by the time John has written this, We're in the very end of the first century, probably 90, 95 AD. And so Christianity has already moved all through the Roman Empire. And so by now, we know because of the Roman persecution, it's likely that most Romans have heard of the name of Jesus that these Christians believe in. And so here's another reason why John probably felt that I need to kind of gradually lead up to explaining about Jesus. If I just jump out and say, let me tell you about Jesus, you probably had a lot of Roman citizens that go, I don't want to hear anything about it, because the people who believe in this Jesus end up getting sent and thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. They end up being crucified on crosses. They end up having all their property taken away from them because of the Roman persecution on Christians. And so what John does instead is he begins to build up. He says, do you believe in the Logos? You believe the Logos would be full of light and truth? Yeah, you do? Well, you believe that the Logos would have sent a messenger to talk about this Logos? Well, yeah, that makes sense. That's what the Logos would do. And he walks through this whole thing, just leading them along. But did you know that the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us? He did what? We've never heard of anything like that. Yeah. He became a man, and he lived here on earth. And the reason he did that was because he wanted to impart and give us this grace, something that's available to you too. Be like, really? You can see just getting their attention and letting them know until he gets to the point of saying, this grace and this truth that he had that is available to all of us, it came through Jesus Christ. And this may have been the point to where they all kind of go, whoa, I've heard about this Jesus. But I've never heard it like this before. Because all the rest of this makes sense. And so you can see what John's been doing in trying to help guide them along in what they believe already to make the connection with Jesus. And so John makes another quick disclaimer then in verse 18. No one has seen God at any time. But the one that God sent, the Logos, now we know is Jesus, he came to dwell among us so that he could explain the Father to us. See what he says at the end of verse 18 there? He said, he who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. This Jesus Christ, he's the Logos. You told me in verse 1 that he is God. The Logos is God. And he's making a connection with the Logos and the Father. And so notice, he's the only, no one has seen God at any time. But Jesus came to explain him, the Father. So we have another connection that we learn about the Father in verse 18, is that first of all, the Father is going to be explained by Jesus. And this is what Jesus does all the way through the Gospel of John. He explains who the Father is over and over and over and over again. And there's sections in chapter 5, beginning of verse 19, chapter 6, verse 44, and chapter 10, verse 15, chapter 14, verse 7. There's sections, I've gone through and circled the word Father all through the text, and there's clumps where there's a lot of fathers in certain sections. And so I kind of honed in on those, and you see Jesus is going into detail about this is who the Father is, this is what the Father has done, this is what the Father wants, and there's all these explanations. Jesus came to explain the Father. And so that's why I've jumped into this study. If Jesus came to explain the Father, I want to know the Father as best as I can too. I want to jump in and see exactly how did Jesus explain the Father? What can he teach me about the Father? And just looking at that very specifically. And so like I said, we're going to be looking at these as we go through. But there's something else in verse 18 about the Father. The Father is God. So as he said, no one has seen God, but this Jesus, He has come to explain the Father to us. The Father is God. He's making that connection. Again, the Greeks and the Romans are going to be going, wait a minute. You're telling me that the Logos became flesh, and the Logos himself is God, and he's going to come down here to earth so that he can explain God to us. To a Greek and to a Roman, they would have been, this is like a kid in a candy shop, is give us more. We want to know more about this God, about this Logos, about this Father. This is different than anything we've ever heard before. Explain it to us. And that's what's going to begin happening in verse 19. In verse 19, now we're going to see the testimony of John the Baptist and what went on with John the Baptist introducing Jesus to other people, and we're going to begin to see Jesus the way that John knew Jesus, all the way through the rest of the gospel. And so we'll pick up there next week.